What's that? Hare Krishna, glories to Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Nitai Gaura Premanandi Haribol. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namani Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharine Nirvisesa Sunyavadi Paskatya Desatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhakti Samati Bhakti Hare Krishna. So today we're going to continue the discussion about the allegory of the cave by Plato and Socrates, and in comparison with the verse 29:34, which says, O Brahma, whatever appears to be of any value, if it is without relation to me, has no reality. Know it as my illusory energy, that reflection which appears to be in darkness. Okay, so I want to thank, first of all, Samukh Prabhu and Shrestha and Prabhulika and Krishna and Divya and I want to thank everyone that did homework. So today we're going to look at the homeworks done by Sanmukh and Shrestha, because all the homework was good, but these two have a lot more detail, and I'm sure some of you had difficulty doing the homework. It's a deep subject, and it requires many years to understand, actually. So one thing I want to go over again is when you compare, like Shrestha and Sanmukh did a good job in comparing the allegory of the cave of Socrates with the verse 29:34. And both Sanmukh and Shrestha found a diagram of Plato's allegory of the cave. So I'm going to read what Shrestha has written. The allegory of the cave, also known as Plato's cave, was a concept used by the philosopher Plato to discuss the negative effects of education on nature. Okay, so let's just look at that phrase, the negative effects of education on nature. What does that mean? That means that education, I guess you would call it materialistic education. Oh, by the way, Socrates and Plato were complaining about education 2,500 years ago in Greece. They were complaining that it was not really good. It was actually misleading people. Well, here it says, the negative effects of education on nature. How can education have a negative effect on nature? Well, in a sense, okay, let's read it a little bit more. It says, in its proper context, it was primarily used to explain what it is like being a philosopher and trying to explain things to the layman. Well, there are philosophers and there are philosophers. So the philosopher, in the name of education, will speculate, and through speculation, the best they can do is a half-truth or no truth. Now, what is a half-truth? Half-truth is like half a hen. Prabhupada gives the example of the story of the half a hen. There was a farmer and his son, and one day the son came up with a great idea. He called his father and said, "Dad, I got a great idea. Every day we got to feed the chickens. So we put the food, we give them food and they take it in the mouth, and later on we get an egg from the bottom of the chicken. Why don't we just cut off the head, and that way we'll just get the egg. We don't have to feed the chicken." And the father was smiling. He said, "Well, no, that won't work, because if you cut off the head, the chicken's dead. It won't give any egg." So that seems pretty clear and easy to explain. But when you get into education, it's not so clear anymore. Because first of all, if you're going to go have education, you're going to deal with educators, and some of them are philosophers, some of them are scientists, and some of them just teach what the scientists and the philosophers write. Now, you would have to analyze the source of the information that's being given in education. Who is producing that source material? You'd have to analyze the person who actually is sourcing, giving the research, who's done research and who's written down conclusions of their research. Well, first of all, we know, even without knowing the name of the persons who have done the research, that every human being has four defects. So whatever they write, whatever research they do, is going to be faulty because of the four defects. That's point one. And then point two is that they themselves may have an agenda, a personal agenda, and therefore, even though they're analyzing facts and drawing conclusions, they might do what's called selective evidence. That is, only accept those things in their research that seem to point to the validity of their theory or the agenda that they're trying to promote, and reject anything else. Now, I'm going to give you a modern example of that. Of course, this theory, the allegory of the cave, was written down 2,500 years ago, but this is something that's recent. It's called this was published in this is produced by the New York Times. So that's a famous paper in New York City. And it's called the 1619 Project, 1619 Project. And it's a project aimed at subverting the teaching of history in American elementary and high schools nationwide. One of its key claims is that America was founded in 1619, the year the first slave arrived on the American shores, rather than in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was declared from England. and proclaimed that all men are created equal. So, what is this? This is a new way of teaching American history from in K-9, or from elementary school up to 12th grade. And so, therefore, what is the New York Times trying to do? They're trying to say that America is a shameful country because its beginnings is based on slavery, exploiting people. That's why they choose 1619 as the founding of the country, because that's when the first slave was brought to America from Africa. And they're ignoring 1776, when some Americans declared the Declaration of Independence. You have George Washington, you have Jefferson, you have Hamilton, and so many of these people in Independence Square in Philadelphia. You can visit it, where there's the Liberty Bell, and that's where they had a big meeting and declared independence from England. And in that declaration, they said all men are created equal. So, of course, there was a big civil war in the 1860s to free the slaves and to stop the exploitation. And even though Jefferson, Washington, other founders of the country had slaves, but they all foresaw that in the future, when they made the Declaration of Independence, they saw that in the future there was going to be a big problem, because on one hand they say all men are created equal, and they all have a right to, the God-given right to happiness and the pursuit of happiness and so forth. So they knew that the question of slaves was going to be a very difficult issue, but they were looking for unity in 1776 against the British. So they didn't want to start America without some southern states in which slavery was prevalent. But by the 1860s, it became clear, due to a lot of what you would call preaching by Christians, that slavery was not a right thing to do. So therefore, it was inhumane. It was mistreating human beings, even though they might not be highly educated, etc. But there are still human beings. Black people are human beings, just like white people. And if your Constitution says all men are created equal, then they are men and women. They're not animals. And therefore, a whole war was fought in order to not only free the slaves, but establish that the different states in the Union could not have a whole population of people who are treated as slaves when they're human beings. And according to the Constitution, every human being has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So now there's a new way. A new way is coming of teaching kids in school the history of America, saying that it started with slavery. In other words, it's implying that it's a bad country. It has bad. Everything that it's done is actually negative and bad. It's not good. Okay, so. We see here that people who write, the people who are educators, and the people who have formulated what they consider knowledge, it may not be knowledge. It's just like having a bottle of poison, but labeling it nectar. So this is so you have to analyze the qualities of the people who are so-called sources of knowledge. Well, coming back to Socrates and Plato, they are sources of knowledge. They're philosophers, and they explain things to common people. So, but if their explanation is not correct, then it's going to mislead people. So let's read a little bit more about what Shasta says, and then also we're going to look at what Sunmukh says, because Sunmukh had some interesting points also. So it says, she says, she prints out the diagram, the model of the cave, and she says, in this allegory. Now, what is an allegory? It's a story that makes a point by using different characters or animals or whatever, but it makes a point. It's teaching something. So anyway, in this allegory, there are prisoners facing the wall of a cave. So a cave is usually a dark place, and there are two walls. One in which the prisoners are chained to chairs, and they can't get out, and they're facing the wall opposite them, and their backs are to a wall behind them. So their backs are facing the opening of the cave. Okay, so their back is toward the direction of the opening of the cave. Unable to turn around. Instead, they're able to see glimpses of light, or what you would call shadows in the darkness, on the wall of the cave which they are facing. So they're facing toward a wall, and their back is against the wall. And the wall is, let's say the prisoners are sitting down and they're like 5 feet high, but the wall behind them is something like 20 feet high. And then next, shadows are cast on the wall by the puppet show performers. So there are people on that 20-foot wall behind the prisoners who are sitting with their back to that 20-foot wall, and they're projecting themselves and other things that they may hold on the wall. And how is it being projected? It says they're like puppet show performers, right? After being stuck in a cave for the entirety of their lives, the prisoners associate all knowledge with the shadows on the wall. How is the shadow being shown? It's because there's a fire behind the puppeteers, and it's casting light, and then the light projects the shadow of the puppeteers on the wall. Okay, so that's all that the prisoners can see. They never see the people. They never see the objects that they're holding up, like birds or trees or whatever they have, and this is purposely being done by these puppeteers. Now, Shasta said, now the story comes alive when one of the prisoners is unshackled. Okay, that means that somehow or other one of the prisoners gets loose, and he climbs up the wall behind him, and what happens? The prisoner is turned around and taken out of the cave by the philosopher. Okay, so there's a philosopher. Why should there be a philosopher? Because Socrates said that philosophers are people more or less in the mode of goodness, and they can see things much more clearly than other people. Most people are so involved in eating, sleeping, mating, and defending, they don't think about, what's the purpose of life other than eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. But philosophers are people who try and find deeper meaning of what is man's purpose in this world. So the philosopher is going to lead the prisoner out of the cave, and he tries to explain that everything outside is real. In other words, everything that the prisoner has seen up until this point in his life, and they've been shackled like this right from the beginning of their life, it's not real. They're just shadows of reality. The philosopher shows the prisoner the real perfect forms of the world. In the real world, he showed the perfect bird, the perfect man, the perfect tree, etc. So why does it use the word perfect? Because Socrates believed that heaven is a place where there are perfect forms of things, and whatever we see in this world is imperfect shadows reflected in the dark. So, right here is a major difference that Shasta is going to point out a little bit later on between Socrates' explanation of the cave and what the verse 2:9-34 explains, and what Krishna consciousness philosophy is about. Krishna consciousness doesn't say that the perfect state of existence or reality is static, whereas Socrates is saying that the perfect stage of reality is static. Static means it doesn't move. It's a perfect form of something that you see an imperfect shadow of in the material world. But according to Bhagavatam, the spiritual world is not static. It's constantly increasing, and it's full of variety, and things get better and better. They don't stay static, and they don't get worse. Okay, so it says, after being stuck in a cave for the entirety of their lives, the prisoners associate all knowledge with the shadows on the wall. For example, they think that what is actually the shadow of a dog is really the dog. So you can do an experiment at home. You turn on the light in a room and put your back toward the light, and let's say you put your hand out. So now I just put my hand out here. Now there's light above me, right? So if I look down on this paper that I'm looking at, I can see the shadow of my hand, because my hand is blocking the light, and it's makes a shadow that looks something like a hand. Like when I move my fingers, the shadow image of the fingers are also moving. Now this story comes alive when the prisoner is unshackled. The prisoner is turned around and taken out of the cave by the philosopher, who tries to explain that everything outside is real. The philosopher shows the prisoner the real perfect forms of the world. In the real world, he showed the perfect bird, perfect man, perfect tree, etc. The prisoner, however, being accustomed to the shadows of the wall, could not believe his eyes and actually preferred to go back to the cave. Now, this is a very interesting point that Socrates is trying to make, that even if you see the truth, even if you hear the truth, it doesn't mean that you're going to understand it. And you might even reject it and say, I don't believe that's the reality. And you go back to your snug, limited form of lifestyle. There's just eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. There's sense gratification. So the prisoner could not believe his eyes and actually preferred to go back to the cave. Plato's cave is a great example which proves that many people are comfortable in their own ignorance and accustomed to it. Okay, that's a very good point. And this is the problem that preachers of Krishna consciousness have. Even though they're trying to preach the truth, most people don't accept it. They feel better, more comfortable in their own ignorance because they're used to it. Just like a pig, if you give a pig a sweet ball, a Krishna conscious bullets, or the Simply Wonderful, the pig won't eat it. But if you give him some stool, he'll eat it. So you see, each animal and each living being has a particular set of senses. And sometimes, if you have a pig-like nature, a human being will eat all rotten things, and when there's something good, they won't accept it. As an example of that, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur went to Burma once. And he was in a village, and he was teaching some of the, I guess he had some disciples there, and they were cooking with ghee, and the other villagers complained that they didn't like the smell of the ghee. Now, in this village, in Burma, they had a special condiment, condiment. Look that word up, condiment. Condiment. Condiment means like a type of spice for flavoring food. Now, how did they make their special village condiment? All the dead animals they would find, like rats and rabbits and mice and snakes and things, they would put into this big pot. And of course the weather is hot there, so and they would put a lid on the pot, and the heat would decompose the dead animals. You know, and there are liquids. There's blood and there's other liquids, and eventually, when everything was decomposed, mostly, I guess they would filter it to filter out the hair and the bones and the teeth and things like that, and then they would boil that filtered goo, and I guess to try and kill as many germs as they can, and to cook it down to be a little more thicker, and then they would bottle it, and they would use that to flavor their food. Now, whenever they'd open the pot to pour off the liquid, it stank. It would stink. It was horrible. But they thought that was good. Now, don't think that this is a fictitious story. And if you ever go to a Vietnamese store, they have these Vietnamese or Southeast Asian stores in which they sell nyak mum. Nyak mum is the liquids that fall off of a dead fish they're hung on it like a string, and all the liquids are collected from these dead fish, and it's boiled, and it's made into like a syrupy type of liquid, and that's put into bottles, and it's sold in the stores. So anytime you go to a Vietnamese store, the whole store stinks of nyak mum. It's such a powerful smell. But they think it's good. And if you're not accustomed to it, you smell it, you want to throw up. Right? So we see how different living entities have different types of perceptions of things. So Plato's cave is a great example which proves that many people are comfortable in their own ignorance and are accustomed to it. Although they were definitely not complete in their philosophy, the allegory of the cave shows how Plato and Socrates almost had the full picture. Well, they didn't almost. They were still far away, but they had some aspects of truth in their allegory of the cave. In Srimad Bhagvatam, however, the full picture is explained. Verse 2934, one of the 4 nutshell verses of Srimad Bhagvatam, explains how one should act under such an event. Okay. Anyway, no, it explains how one should see reality in its actuality. The translation should be, anyway, the translation of the verse states, O Brahma, whatever appears to be of any value, if it is without relation to me, has no reality. Know it as my illusory energy, that reflection which appears to be in darkness. So, this idea of a reflection in darkness, Socrates and Plato got that mostly right. But the rest of what they wrote is more or less half-truth or no truth. See, there's half-truth and there's no truth. So this verse perfectly captures the concept of material creation in relation to the spiritual world. Why should we have a concept of material creation in relation to the spiritual world? Because material creation is relative truth and the spiritual world is absolute truth. So what does that mean? Well, relative truth means it depends on something else. And absolute truth means it doesn't depend on anything. It stands by itself. It's not depending on anything else. So the absolute truth is Krishna and Vaikuntha or Goloka, and relative truth is the material world. Relative in the sense that it's a shadow perverted reflection of the spiritual world. A shadow perverted reflection. Not only it's a shadow, but it's also perverted, which is even more complicated. So, when Krishna says, when Sukadeva Goswami in this verse says that, this is being spoken to Brahma, and it says, O Brahma, whatever appears to be of any value, if it is without relation to me, so Krishna is speaking to Brahma, has no reality. Wow, that's a very powerful statement. No reality. That means if you see the shadow of my hand and you want to shake my hand, shake the shadow of my hand, you would end up with empty air. You wouldn't. There would not be any. There would not be a real hand there, although it looks something like a hand, but it has no reality. It's only an indication that there is reality somewhere else. So this verse, where it says, if something appears to be of value, but if it has no relationship to Krishna, it has no reality at all. Know it as my illusory energy. It's an illusion. That reflection which appears to be in darkness. So Shasta correctly says, this verse perfectly captures the concept of material creation in relation to the spiritual world. Everything is created and maintained and destroyed by Krishna. He is the cause of all causes, and he has no beginning or end. Therefore, everything in existence exists only due to its prime relationship with the Lord. In other words, to its relationship with the Lord. Everything you see is relative to the Lord. The Lord is absolute, and everything else is relative to him. By the way, many modern philosophers say there's no such thing as absolute truth. So you see how they, by using flowery language, they factor out Krishna completely from the possibility of perception. And in other words, they're dumbing down people It's just like, writing a new history of America, saying it started in 1861 when the first slave arrived in America. Well, wait a minute. Why don't you go back further? Why don't you say the history of America began when the first native Indians inhabited the land by crossing over from what's today Russia to Alaska, and then eventually going down south. You could say that, and then you could say that was maybe, according to their speculation, 50,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago, right? So you can see that depending on what agenda people have, they make up a myth. M-Y-T-H. Look that up. Myth. N-Y-T-H. M-Y-T-H. What is a myth? It's some story that has no factual basis, but it tries to explain something. That's what a myth is. So, and then mythology is, a whole series of stories about gods or the creation of the world or this or that. That's something made up, and it's to just give us a general idea that maybe it might have been like this, but there's no facts to it. Well, that's why if you approach things without relationship to Krishna, whatever it is that you're going to produce, it can be a scholarly paper, it can be a thesis for a PhD, it can be a patented discovery of something. If it has no relationship to Krishna, it has no reality. Now, this is a pretty harsh conclusion, because people say, oh, wait a minute, we don't believe that. Look, there's cell phones, and there's bridges, and there's rockets, and there's airplanes, and there's this, and there's that. Are you saying that has no reality? Well, it's relative. It's not absolute. Oh, wait a minute, there's no such thing as absolute. That's some myth of theology, of religion. No, there are absolute things. Like, for example, everyone is born, will get old, get sick, and die. You're going to say that's not absolute? You have any example of someone who didn't die? Who didn't get old, who didn't get sick, and died? Even Jesus Christ was born, he lived for 33 years, he was crucified, and he died. Okay, he resurrected, so-called, but he went through those 4 stages. So that's an absolute. And how about fire burns? Would you say fire doesn't burn in some cases? No, it burns. And you want to test it? Okay, go right ahead and test it. You can put ice all around your hand and put your hand in the fire. It'll eventually burn. So, see, there are absolutes even in the material world, but the whole material world is relative, though, compared in relationship to Krishna, and Krishna is the real absolute truth. Okay, so now she says, therefore, everything in existence exists only due to its relation with the Lord. Let me have to think about that statement. Let's go on. When one forgets this relationship and begins to think that things are real without the connection with the Lord, they become deluded. Okay, now that's correct. So, when one forgets the relation, everything in existence exists only due to its prime relation with the Lord. Well, there's no prime or secondary. Everything is related to Krishna because everything depends on Krishna. Everything has come from Krishna. Everything is made of Krishna's energy. And when everything is destroyed, it goes back to Krishna. So there's no existence independent of Krishna. That's the whole point. When one becomes deluded, they fall under the control of Mahamaya. Deluded means you believe something to be true that's not true, and you act as if it is true. So that's a state of delusion. So, when one becomes deluded, they fall under the control of Mahamaya. Mahamaya is the illusory energy in the material world, by which one goes away from Krishna, as opposed to Yogamaya, which is an illusion, in the material or spiritual world, by which one comes closer to Krishna. So they fall under, when one becomes deluded, they fall under the control of Mahamaya, who throws them into the darkness of illusion and covers the eyes of the living entity. Falling under this illusion put forth by the Lord's external energy, those with a poor fund of knowledge try to come up with theories to describe the order of the universe. Okay. Yeah, they're already in a deluded state, and now they're trying to theorize what is reality. In the end, they do not realize that all of their scientific studies are just the effects of the illusion they have been put under. Srila Prabhupada said in the purport, these scientific studies of the cosmic manifestation or the bodily construction, independent of the Supreme Lord, are different reflective intellectual gymnastics only, but at the end, they are all illusion and nothing more. Ah, very good. This is exactly the same as the allegory of the cave presented by Plato. The prisoners are under the illusion and believe the shadow counterparts are reality. Okay, yes, like we said, some of Plato's and Socrates' explanation of the allegory of the cave is true, and some of it is half true, and some of it is not true at all. Like, for example, that the spiritual world is static. That's not true at all. But the fact that there is a spiritual world, that's true. Some people say there's no such thing as a spiritual world. Well, that's not true at all. So at least Socrates is saying there is some kind of spiritual world where everything is where there are perfect forms of things that you see only shadows of in the material world. Well, what we see in the material world is a shadow reflection in darkness. So that idea is true. Okay, so now, through the help of a pure devotee, sometimes those who are in illusion are able to be brought from the clutches of Maya to see the light of the day. Well, yeah, now we're getting into the real gist of the issue. You have to have association with a pure devotee. Then the illusion that we're prisoners of can be elucidated. E-L-U-C-I-D-A-T-E-D. E-L-U-C-I-D-A-T-E-D. Look that word up. It means the light of knowledge comes upon you. This is described by the philosopher bringing out the prisoner and helping the prisoner realize the real world. Yeah, but the philosopher wasn't able to convince him, so the prisoner went back. There are two main faults with the allegory of the cave. Mainly, it does not have the concept of God. Correct, because, well, it does not have a personal concept of God. And secondly, all the beings in the real world are perfect, non-changing entities. Well, no, everybody, this is actually false, because in the spiritual world, all the entities are constantly, exponentially increasing in beauty. Beauty in every other way. So exponentially is an important word. E-X-P-O-T. I'm sorry. E-X-P-O-N-E-N-T-I-A-L-L-Y. That means to 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 4 is 8, 2 times 8 is 16, 2 times 16 is 32, 2 times 32 is 64, 2 times 64 is 128, etc. That's called exponentially. It's always increasing in multiples, not just increasing one thing at a time, but multiplies. This is explained beautifully in the Krishna book many times. One example is explained in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Harivilas 4.192. Okay. The beauty of Lord Krishna increases at the sight of the beauty of the gopis. And she's quoting. And the more the gopis see Lord Krishna's beauty, the more their beauty increases. So, in the spiritual world, beauty is always evolving and exponentially increasing in the spiritual world. Okay, so there's an example of exponentially increasing. More important than this difference, however, Plato's cave leaves out the most important part of the puzzle. The Lord is the origin of everything. Correct. In Srimad Bhagvatam 2.9.33, the Lord says, Brahma, it is myself, nor was there the material nature the cause of the creation. In other words, he's saying, I am the cause of everything. Krishna is saying, that which you see now is also I, because whatever you see has come from Krishna. It's his energy in different forms. It is I, the personality of Godhead. And after annihilation, what remains will also be I. So when creation, material creation is all over, it's all wound up into the Lord, including the living entities. Without the Lord, the illusory energy would not exist. Therefore, even though there are many similarities between the concept of the cave and the contents of Srimad Bhagavatam 2.9.34, Plato and Socrates' philosophy is lacking the complete picture and is therefore not correct. Very good. Now, Sanmukh, he also has a picture, the same picture that Shrestha found of the allegory of the cave. But he does something that's interesting. He makes a comparison. So let's look at that. And he says, the below is a table that tells some of the differences and similarities of Plato's point of view on the soul and a devotee in Krishna consciousness point of view on the soul. Well, he's going to compare Plato's concept of the soul with the Krishna conscious concept of the soul. Now, I'm not sure where he got this information from, but I'll read it, and I want Sanmukh to tell me where he got his information from. Send me an email and tell me. So he says, there's a statement, there's Plato's point of view about that statement, and there's Krishna conscious point of view about the statement. The soul takes up no space and is immortal. It is in existence before the body, and it continues to exist when the body dies. Well, yeah, that's true. The soul exists before the body, this present material body, and exists after the body dies. That is true. But where did you get the statement, the soul takes up no space and is immortal? Well, yeah, the soul is immortal, no doubt about it. But when he says it takes up no space, and he says Plato's point of view agrees with this statement, and Krishna conscious point of view agrees with this statement. Well, when you say it takes up no space, in Krishna consciousness it says that the soul is 1/10,000th the tip of a hair. So that's a measure. So it has to take up some space, although that space is so small you can't see it. But it still is describing something. It's not saying it has... If it doesn't take up any space, then you would say that it doesn't exist. Anyway, tell me where you got the statements from. Okay, next. The soul was in existence before the body, and it continues to exist when the body dies. Yeah, that's true. But where does Plato say that? Well, yes, Socrates believes that the soul of a person existed before this body, and he proves that in an example where he says that all knowledge is innate. Now that's your homework is to find out all knowledge is innate. What does that mean? INNATE. In other words, it's saying innate means it's within you. Why? Well, because your soul was originally with God, part and parcel of Krishna. So, therefore, you should have innate knowledge of Krishna. And your soul has gone through many different lifetimes in different bodies. So all those experiences in those different bodies is innate. It's somewhere in your subtle mind. So look up. So what does he mean? All knowledge is innate. So Socrates said, it proved it. He takes a young boy who's never studied arithmetic or math, and he asks him some questions. And then through a series of questions, the boy actually, in the beginning, he doesn't say he knows math or arithmetic because he's never learned it. But through a series of questions, Socrates proves that he has knowledge of math and arithmetic. And he says this is a proof that it's innate. It's indwelling in the soul of the person because they've already experienced this in other bodies. Anyway, look that up. So that second statement is actually correct. It was in existence before the body, and it continues to exist when the body dies. So Socrates agrees with that, and that is Krishna conscious philosophy. When one dies, the soul, and the third point he makes, when one dies, the soul is free for a short time before being entrapped once again in another body. So this is about reincarnation. Now, I don't know. So I would like to know where you got that from Socrates or Plato's writing. Jai Shri Radha Nila Madhava Ki Jai. We'll continue after this opening of deities. Haribol. Haribol. So we're going to continue now. Obviously, when the soul dies, when one dies, the soul is free for a short time before being entrapped once again in another body. Well, because Socrates said all knowledge is innate, and it's in the soul, and the soul is eternal. So yeah, he definitely would believe in reincarnation also. So Sanmukh did send just now the source for this information, and that's good. The reason I'm reading this chart is because Jai Shri Shri Radha Nilamada Vikiche, because it has, he's done some research, and that's important to get a more clear understanding of a subject. You have to do research. And okay, so now the next point, the soul is immaterial and immortal. Okay, when you say immaterial, it's not made of matter. I guess that's what you mean. So that's true. So Socrates believes that, and the Vedas teach that. The belief that one only has true knowledge and understanding of reality through reasoning. Well, Socrates believed that. The Vedic tradition would say something a little different. It says the belief that one only has true knowledge and understanding of reality through reason. No, because we have 4 defects. The Vedic tradition would say, well, you can use, the Vedic knowledge is deductive, but however, the emphasis in Vedic knowledge is to rely on parampara, and to have contact with a pure devotee and learn the correct understanding of the Vedic literatures, especially Srimad Bhagvatam and Bhagavad Gita. So it's not simply reasoning. And then whatever is the source of its own motion or animation must be immortal. So if something is moving, it must be immortal. That's definitely something that the Greeks believe. And you say that the Greeks believe this, yes, but the Vedic knowledge does not accept such a thing. Well, the Vedic knowledge says that there is para and apara prakriti. So, para prakriti is the superior spiritual energy, and apara prakriti is the inferior spiritual energy. So, that doesn't mean that only things that move are immortal. So you're correct. That's why you put no on the Vedic side. Okay. And any knowledge we have of the physical world is through our senses and is subjective and inexact. Well, okay, Socrates believes that. And the Vedas believe that. Any knowledge we have of the physical world is through our senses and is subjective and inexact. Yeah, okay. That's called empirical knowledge. And both agree. Good. So the only one I had a question about, let's see. No, I don't have, was the belief that that one only has true knowledge and understanding of reality through reasoning. That's the only one I have a question about, that I don't think that's true. Yes, Socrates thought that was true. Modern scientists and philosophers think that's true. But the Vedas understand that true knowledge can be understood by revelation, by the mercy of the Lord. And this is 10th chapter, 10th verse, where Krishna says, Tesam satata yuktanam bhajtam pritipurvakam. When one engages in pure devotional service, unwavering in all circumstances, the Lord reveals knowledge to the living entity. So it's more than just reasoning. It's by revelation and the mercy of the Lord. Okay, very good. And then Sanmuk continues. In the Srimad Bhagvatam 2.9.34, it states that whatever has any value should always be related to Krishna. If it isn't being related to the Lord, then it has no reality. And it should be known as Krishna's illusory energy, and that reflection which appears in the darkness, this can be related to Plato's theory because the people are thinking that the shadows are the reality and that there's nothing greater than that. Good. And then in Bhagavad Gita 10.11 he writes, it is said that Krishna is in everyone's heart and he helps us destroy, he says it's a mistake of English, he helps us destroy ignorance by the shining light of, by the shining lamp of knowledge. He wrote, by the shining of the knowledge lamp. Okay. This can be compared to the Plato's theory because Krishna is kind of like the policeman who helps us be free of our ignorance or the chains, and Krishna, the policeman, drags us to reality and helps be free of the material existence. That's not a good example. In other words, in the Bhagavad Gita 10.11, Tesam ivanukampartam aham agyanamam tamat nasyami apabhavasto gyanachit pain basvato. Krishna is in everyone's heart and he helps us destroy ignorance by the shining lamp of knowledge. Okay, well that's true, yes. This can be compared to Plato's theory because Krishna is kind of like the policeman who helps us be free of our ignorance. Anyway, an example or a comparison is only good as there are many points of concurrence or many points of similarity. So, what actually, rather than talking about a policeman, you talk about the sun. The sun is the source of light. That light is coming originally from Krishna. And when there's sunshine, you can see things as they are. That would have been a better analogy to make rather than the policeman. Okay, and then the last statement in the Bhagavad Gita 15:1-4 states, but with determination one must cut down this strongly rooted tree with the weapon of detachment. Okay, you're talking about the the inverted banyan tree in the material world. This can be compared to Plato's idea because the weapon of detachment is ignoring the person who has seen the reality itself. And when he comes to tell that the shadows are not the reality, but it is the weapon ignoring which cuts down the belief in the strongly rooted tree. Anyway, I can see what you're trying to do, but the language doesn't explain it properly. But with determination, one must cut down the strongly rooted tree with the weapon of detachment. Okay, that's what Krishna says. That's clear. Okay, so anyway, you can redo that. The statement, which is perfectly clear in the Bhagavad Gita, you're trying to make an analogy to what Plato says, and you should explain that better. Anyway, okay, so now we said that there are half-truths and there's no truths, and every person has 4 defects, and also oftentimes people have a personal agenda, and therefore they use selective evidence to try and establish their theory, and they ignore other evidence. Therefore, whenever someone like Plato or Socrates or the New York Times with their new 1619 theory of the origin of America, you have to analyze, are these people who are, is this person or persons who are writing this book of knowledge, like in the case of the New York Times, the history of the United States, or Plato in the allegory of the cave, are they above the modes of material nature? 1. And are they basing their knowledge on statements originally made by Krishna or pure devotees like Sukadeva Goswami, or are they speculating? And do they have 4 defects? Do they have a personal agenda? So these are questions we have to ask about the author of a so-called book of knowledge. It can be a book of dealing with anything: archaeology, geology, philosophy, mathematics, whatever. So if we don't ask these questions and we just accept a book of so-called knowledge as real knowledge, we make a mistake. So there is a preliminary analysis that has to be made before you spend the time, energy, and money to buy a book. So the number 1 point is this person who's writing this book of so-called knowledge, are they subject to the 4 defects? 2, do they have a personal agenda? 3, which would mean they would engage in selective evidence rather than the whole evidence. Are they above the influence of the mode? 3, are they above the influence of the modes of material nature? And 4, do they base their knowledge on Vedic evidence and scriptures, or do they use empirical methods? So that is, empirical methods means only that knowledge that they can perceive with their senses. So here we see 4 tests of an author of a book of so-called knowledge before we read it. Otherwise, you're going to waste your time, and you're going to most likely be misled. So therefore, if we just stick to Srimad Bhagavatam, which is Amala Purana, you can look that word up, Amala Purana, which means Amala has no fault in it, and Purana means history or Vedic history. So there we're sure, and so is Bhagavad Gita. Because Bhagavad Gita is directly spoken about Krishna, and Srimad Bhagavatam is spoken about Krishna. And in that way, we're not going to be misled. So anything that apparents, let's take a look at that word. Apparents, I think that's the correct word. Vedic knowledge can be accepted as generally correct. Let's see, apparent definition. Definition of the word apparent. It says, able to be seen or understood, seeming to exist or to be true. Okay, so now I'm using the word in the sense that it comes close or it is exactly based on Vedic knowledge. So, for example, Socrates says that the soul is immortal. Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says the soul is immortal. Therefore, Socrates is right. Because it comes close or is exactly the same as Vedic knowledge. Whereas if you say, Socrates says there is a spiritual world, but it's static. Vedas say it's dynamic. Therefore, Socrates is wrong. See? So sometimes people get it right. They say something that can be validated. And let's look that word up. Validated, V-A-L-I-D-A-T-E-D. Proven true. Something that's proven true. Validated by statements in the Vedas, then you can accept it. So therefore, there's a proverb in Prabhupada quotes also that you can accept truth even from a unclean person. Let's say there's a drunkard, and one day you're speaking to this drunkard, and he said, "Sonny, I want to give you some good advice. Everything is impermanent in this world." I mean, he's a drunkard, right? But yet he just said something that's true. You know, so you can accept knowledge even from the drunkard. You know, because it apparents or it comes true. It's close or exactly what's said in the Vedas. So that's the criterion. 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 That's the fact check basis. That what is it? If it's said in the Vedas and somebody says the same thing today, either they did it by accident or they speculated and they got it right, then you can accept it as true. And if it's different than what's said in the Vedas, then you know it's not true. And if they're definitely adamant that it has nothing to do with Krishna or God, then it's not true. Okay. So that's what we're trying to learn here. Because Socrates and Plato are considered some of the greatest philosophers in the whole history of the Western world, not the Eastern world, but the Western world. But you can see how they get some things right and they get other things wrong. But how do we know it's wrong? Only because we're using the Vedas as the basis of our understanding. If we use some other text as the basis of our understanding, then we'd have to analyze who wrote it, and if 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 they're free of the four defects, they have no personal agenda, they don't use selective evidence, they're above the modes of material nature, and do they base any of their facts on the Vedic evidence and scripture? So now we're getting a way to judge and understand the validity of an author or a source of knowledge. And if you don't do this, then you're going to end up reading so many books, and because there's millions of books out there, everyone's touting their book. Oh, this is going to change humanity. This is a life-changing experience reading this book or watching this movie or whatever. But actually, you're wasting your time. So why waste your time? See. Okay, so we did say that there's some homework. So we went through a bunch of words like apparent, A-P-P-A-R-A-N-T, validate or validated, criterion, absolute truth and relative truth, and elucidated, exponentially, and all knowledge is innate, empirical, para and apara, knowledge by revelation. So you should understand these phrases and words. They're all important. And then our homework, first of all, understand half-truth or no truth. Understand 4 criterions. There may be more. You can do some research, see if there's more. 4 criterions that should be met before you read a book or accept knowledge. 1, does the author of this book, or it could be a textbook also, do they have any of the 4 defects? Does the author have a personal agenda? Does the author use selective evidence? That's another phrase, selective evidence. It means you only accept that evidence that seems to point to the validity of what you're trying to prove. And you reject any other evidence that may counter your thesis. And then, is this person above the influence of the modes of material nature? And last, do they base their knowledge, does this person base his or her knowledge on Vedic evidence and scriptures, or do they just use the empirical method, relying only on that knowledge that they can see with their senses or perceive with their senses? And yeah, there's two other words you should learn. So there are 2 words. One is called numinous, N-U-M-I-O-U-S. Let's see what that says. Numinous says, having strong religious or spiritual quality, indicating or suggesting the presence of a divinity. That's not... Numinous is a concept derived from the Latin numen, meaning arousing spiritual or religious emotion, mysterious or awe-inspiring. The term was popularized by the German theologian Rudolf Otto in his influential 1917 German book Das Heilige. Das Heilige, Heilige means what is higher, what is superior. which appeared in English as The Idea of the Holy in 1923. So numinous means supernatural, mysterious, filled with the sense of the presence of divinity or holy, appearing to the higher emotions or to the aesthetic sense, spiritual. So it's a good word to know, numinous. And second word is, you know the second one. 1 second. Phenomenal. Phenomenal. Very remarkable, extraordinary, perceptible by the senses or through immediate experience. That's it. So now you have two words. One is numinous and one is phenomenal. Now why do I say this? Because knowledge is not only phenomenal. That's the whole point. And this is explained in the 7th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Prabhupada says, okay. Jnanam teham cha vijnanam idam vaksyami asesataha yajgatva neha bhihonyaj gatavyam avasisyate. So this is 7th chapter, 2nd verse. You have to read this verse. I shall now declare unto you, Krishna speaking to Arjuna, in full this knowledge, both phenomenal and numinous. This being known, nothing further shall remain for you to know. So, most of modern books of knowledge are dealing with the phenomenal and ignore the numinous. Therefore, you only have half the hen. Even less than that, because the phenomenal world is much less than the numinous world. So Prabhupada says, complete knowledge includes knowledge of the phenomenal world, the spirit behind it, and the source of both of them. Three things. Not just the phenomenal world and the spiritual world, or the spirit world, but also the source of both of them. This is transcendental knowledge. The Lord wants to explain the above-mentioned system of knowledge because Arjuna is Krishna's confidential friend, confidential devotee and friend. In the beginning of the 4th chapter, this explanation was given by the Lord, and it is again confirmed here. Complete knowledge can be achieved only by the devotee of the Lord in disciplic succession, directly from the Lord. See, now we have a theory of knowledge. See, this is what we're talking about today. Therefore, one should be intelligent enough to know the source of all knowledge, who is the cause of all causes, and the only object for meditation and all types of yoga practice. When the cause of all causes becomes known, then everything knowable becomes known, and nothing remains unknown. The Vedas, Mundaka Upanishad 1.3 says, Kasmin bhagavo vigyate sarvam idam vigyatam bhavanti. Basically, what that means is, if you know Krishna, you know everything. If you don't know Krishna, you know very little or nothing. So let's. I'm going to find the. Let's see. There's an alternate translation to that. So today's lesson is all about the theory of knowledge. Because if you don't, because you go to school to get knowledge, but if you don't have any theory of knowledge, you'll end up with ignorance. Because you don't know what actual knowledge is. Most people don't know what knowledge is. That's why they buy all these books. You know, you go to the airport, there's a big bookstore, right? You go to Amazon, there's millions of books. Okay, let's see. Sutra Upanishad. This is Mundaka. Yes, yeah, 270. Okay. All right, let's see what it says. Yasmin Vigatam Sarvam Vivam Vigatam. If one can understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the controller of all controllers, one can understand everything else. And here in Bhagavad Gita it says, when the cause of all causes becomes known, that means the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then everything knowable becomes known and nothing remains unknown. And here it says, if one can understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the controller of all controllers, one can understand everything else. There you go. So, this is the fundamental principle of knowledge. If you don't know Krishna, everything else you think you know, you won't really know. And there's a famous author in America in the 19th century said, that ignorance is dangerous, but when people think they know something that they don't really understand, that's more dangerous. Huh? Yeah, yes. It says, Bir fakir khatrejan. Half a philosopher is not a philosopher, right? Or bir hakim khatrejan. Half doctor is no doctor. And half knowledge is dangerous, right? A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. That's the saying. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. That's the actual saying. You're translating from the Hindi. That's not. So what I said was the Hindi version, but what I just said is the American version. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Okay, so your homework is to write an essay on verse 7th chapter, 2nd verse. Write an essay on the theory of knowledge. And I gave a lot of information today about the theory of knowledge. Okay. Any questions anyone would like to ask? If you have any questions, you can just type it out, send it to our IT expert, Dr. Daniel. Jai Shri Radha Madhava Ki Jai. So I'll wait a few minutes if you have any questions, and then we will come to the end. Anything coming in, Daniel? Okay. Someone is typing. That means someone is alive. Yeah.
So if there are any apparent contradictions with any other knowledge, then that knowledge is incorrect.
If there's any apparent contradiction of Vedic knowledge, not just any other knowledge,
Vedic knowledge with any other source of knowledge, then that knowledge
between any other source of knowledge and Vedic knowledge, then you should ignore it. Ignore it. Because there's no way, it's just going to be misleading, that's all. I mean, there's so many books of philosophy, right? Most of them are just speculation and nonsense. That's why Prabhupada wrote, there's a book, Dialectic Spiritualism, right? Where he's analyzing all the philosophers. And some of them have something right, most of them have most things wrong. So he's pointing out that they're big. Why? Because his baseline criterion is Vedic knowledge. Just like he said, They say they went to the moon, and all they saw was dust. So therefore, they did not go to the moon, because the Vedas say the moon is a heavenly planet. You see, so the baseline is Vedas, Vedic knowledge. Now, this could be one of the biggest hoaxes in the last century, that they went to the moon. And people still believe it, and they'll argue back and forth. Some people argue they never went to the moon. Other people argue they did go to the moon. Prabhupada said in 1968, I don't think they went to the moon, because what they're describing is not the moon. So he didn't have to, do a lot of research, look at the NASA pictures and see anomalies in the pictures and all that. He could tell right away. I have a friend of mine who was doing space exploration, spent a lot of money on it. And I told him, I said, you're wasting your money. He said, well, how do you know that? I said, look, you can't even go from India to America without getting permission from the Americans. You got to get a visa, you have to have, medical check, this thing, that thing. So how are you going to go to the moon with the superior beings on the moon? You think they're going to let you come in there just because you have a rocket? And he said, no, I don't believe that. So he did give up. I told him 5 years from now we'll talk about it. So 5 years later I saw him. I said, so I sold the company. Okay, so we will adjourn. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. You see, you can waste your whole life reading all these different books and in the quest of knowledge, and actually you end up with nothing.
Not knowing what is right.
Yeah. You have to have a theory of knowledge. In fact, let's see what that word is, theory of knowledge.
Epistemology is the truth of knowledge, the source of knowledge?
No, epistemology is the science of how you know if something is true or false. It's not the science, but it's how you know if something is true or false. It's a great subject. Theory of Knowledge by Bertrand Russell, 1926. Theory of knowledge is a product of doubt. When we have asked ourselves seriously whether we really know anything at all, we are naturally led into an examination of knowing in the hope of being able to distinguish trustworthy beliefs from such as are untrustworthy. Thus, Kant, the founder of modern theory of knowledge, represents a natural reaction against Hume's skepticism. Few philosophers nowadays would assign to this subject quite such a fundamental importance as it had in Kant's critical system. Nevertheless, it remains an essential part of philosophy. It is perhaps unwise to begin with a definition of the subject, since, as elsewhere in philosophical discussions, definitions are controversial and will necessarily differ for different schools, but we may at least say that the subject is concerned with the general conditions of knowledge insofar as they throw light upon truth and falsehood. This is a bunch of nonsense. This is a bunch of nonsense, I mean, he can write English, yes, but he starts by saying theory of knowledge is a product of knowledge. And by the end of the paragraph, he says, it is perhaps unwise to begin with a definition of the subject. He just started with a definition of the subject, right? Since, as elsewhere in philosophical discussions, definitions are controversial and will necessarily differ for different schools. But we may at least say that in other words, everything is relative. Nothing is absolute. We may at least say that the subject is concerned with the general conditions of knowledge insofar as they throw light upon truth and falsehood. What are the general conditions? He goes from one unknown to another unknown, Yeah. Yeah, you see, it's a lot of literature, but not much content. By the time you finish reading a book like his, you're more confused than not. This was my problem in college. I was always feeling as if I'm learning something, but it's not really something that I'm sure about.
You have studied all of this pretty much.
No, but